Welcome to Reading for Irony, Conflict, and Tension with your professor, Dr. Lydia CdeBaca. The purpose of this lesson is to expand on the paradox form of literary analysis by explaining how one can use the ironies, conflicts, and tensions in the formal features of a work of literature in order to make an argument about the work's meaning. In this lesson, you will understand the role of complexity in literary analysis, review the paradox literary analysis invention strategy, learn to identify tensions, conflicts, and ironies in literature, and see some examples of formal or structural tensions in works of literature. In her work, A Method for Teaching Invention in the Gateway Literature class, composition scholar Joanna Wolf surveys several examples of scholarly research and finds that, quote, the fundamental assumption of critical inquiry is that literature is complex, and to understand it requires patient unraveling, translating, decoding, interpretation, and analyzing. Meaning is never obvious or simple. By defining a work as complex, a critic indirectly asserts that it is a valuable site of study. In other words, he or she makes an argument of evaluation. Even texts that seem shallow and transparent, such as most Arnold Schwarzenegger films, are shown to be valuable sites of study when careful unraveling and decoding reveal their undercurrents and tensions. In other words, when making an analytical argument about a work of literature, it is a convention of literary analysis to show what underlying meanings or elements make the work more complex than it might appear at first sight. So this is something that literary scholars do. And this is something that is a convention of writing in the literary analysis genre. This requires some excavation of the text, digging up meanings like an archaeologist digs up cultural relics. The last two metaphors that Wolf uses, undercurrents and tensions, offer us powerful examples of how we can not only understand, but begin to explain in an essay how a work is complex. First, undercurrent. An undercurrent occurs in oceans and rivers when the water below the surface moves in a different direction from the water above the surface. It creates a set of powerful forces that, in some places, pull away from each other, while in others, push powerfully against each other. Next, tension. Tension is pressure, often occurring when there are two things pulling in opposing directions. Both of these terms, undercurrents and tension, relate to literary study because the more one digs into the language and narrative elements of a story, the more one may start to find elements that don't make sense together. The language may exert a force away from the point of view, for instance, or there may be a symbol that opposes the work's characterization or setting. Recognizing opposing forces in literature is to recognize its complexity. Remember that complexity is part of what scholars argue makes literature a valuable site of study. Paradox is a literary device that appears as a statement or theme that, at first, doesn't seem to make sense since it brings together two opposing ideas. Let's look at a few examples of paradox in literature from the website that we've been using for literary devices. According to the website on literary devices, a paradox is a statement that appears to be self-contradictory or silly, but which may include a latent truth or an underlying truth. It is also used to illustrate an opinion or statement contrary to accepted traditional ideas. A paradox is often used to make a reader think over an idea in an innovative way. So some common examples, your enemy's friend is your enemy, right? Or the enemy of my friend is my enemy. What a pity that youth must be wasted on the young. He is a wise fool. I can resist anything but temptation. So paradox, examples of paradox can be witty or funny, like in this example from Oscar Wilde, or they can be sort of thought-provoking or pithy statements. Here's some examples of paradox in literature. Let's scroll down to Shakespeare's Hamlet. So Hamlet says in this play at one point, "I must be cruel to be kind." At first sight, this doesn't seem to make sense, right? How can an individual treat others kindly even when he's cruel, or vice versa? How can someone be cruel to someone else and then be considered kind? But here, Hamlet is talking about his mother and how he has to kill Claudius to avenge his father's death. Skip that one. Here's another one from My Heart Leaps Up When I Behold by William Wordsworth. He says, "The child is father of the man." Again, doesn't seem to make sense at first, but looking deeper, the poet is saying that childhood experiences become the basis for all adult occurrences. A person's childhood shapes his life and consequently fathers or creates the grown-up adult. You could also, I think, even read it as like fathers or children are, the child is the father of mankind, right? Because we're all children first. And so let's look here at the function of paradox. The above reading may bring out the question, why is paradox used when a message can be conveyed in a straightforward and simple manner? You might be asking the same kind of question about why you would use paradox to analyze literature. I think the answer to both questions is the same, and it's in the nature and purpose of literature. One function of literature is to make the readers enjoy reading. It should have a pleasant effect. And this presumes that readers enjoy more when they extract the hidden meanings out of the writing rather than having something just presented to them in an uncomplicated manner. So instead of just being given the right answer, it's more exciting, it's more fun to search for it and to figure out what the underlying meanings are. Again, that excavation process or that digging process. And to return to our presentation. So, thinking about how this idea of paradox, which we've just seen in examples from literature, can be applied to your own essays in which you're analyzing literature, we return to Joanna Wolf. Paradox is one of the forms of literary analysis argument that she explains in her essay, which I introduced originally in the How to Compose a Textual Analysis video. According to Wolf, the paradox is a version of the appearance versus reality argument in which two aspects of a literary work that initially seem irreconcilable are brought together into a unified whole. In other words, paradox helps to unearth the complexity of a work of literature by taking elements that seem to be opposed to each other and showing how they actually work toward a single central idea. You may remember that irony also deals in opposites. So when you have things opposing each other, like the opposite of what you expect to happen or saying the opposite of what you actually mean. For this reason, spotting ironies in a work can help you identify a paradox, undercurrent, or tension. Similarly, analyzing the conflict in a work and recognizing how its resolution works with or against other elements in the text can show you how paradox works in that work of literature. All of these, irony, conflict, tension, paradox, also not on here, but contradiction as well. All of these are terms for identifying the same basic tendency in works of literature, which is to include some opposing or seemingly irreconcilable elements in order to then reconcile them into a unified whole. Let's look at some examples. One conflict or tension in The Hamon and the Beans is between the focalization of time in the telling of the story and the rigid routine of the fort as marked by the bugle call. What might this reveal about the relationship of ways that we think about time, for instance, memory or history? What might it reveal about the relationship of story to history? Could you say, for instance, that this story is a form of history, or that the histories included in the story are just examples of other stories? Another tension or irony in The Hammond and the Beans is the author's use of emotionally flat language, understatement, to describe scenes of terror and violence, such as the lynching of Chonita's biological father. How does this tension relate to the narrative as a whole? In I Only Came to Use the Phone, one irony is that at the very moment that Maria, for the first time in her adult life, has a strong sense of her own identity, as a wife, for instance, others mistake her identity for that of another woman. Indeed, when we look up the definition of identity, and by the way, looking up the definitions of words, especially words that relate strongly to a central idea or theme, can be a great way to expose contradictions or tensions in a work. So when we look up the definition of identity, we see there are two opposing definitions. The first definition is about sameness. The second definition is about difference or distinguishing characteristics. How are these two opposing definitions reconciled in the story? So notice that I ended both of those examples with questions. That leads us to understanding the steps to crafting a paradox argument. The first step in using paradox, irony, tension, and conflict when developing an analysis is to identify the opposition, tension, or conflict and explain what the two opposing forces are. These might be on the level of language. For instance, there might be some opposition or tension in the diction, the syntax, in symbols or metaphors. Or it could also be on the level of the narrative elements. So there might be some opposition or tension in the point of view, in the characterization, setting, or conflict. The opposition could also be between some aspect of literary technique, the language, such as symbol, metaphor, or diction, and a narrative element. For instance, the tone of a passage might contradict the setting, or a specific symbol in a work might contradict the characterization or point of view. The next step is to ask questions. How does this contradiction relate to the central idea of the story itself? How is it resolved in the telling of the story? Or how is it resolved in the language? Finally, seek the answers to these questions in the text itself. Look closely at the language and how the story is told, identifying patterns and perhaps using other forms of argument such as ubiquity or appearance versus reality. Then use these answers to begin to craft a thesis. This form of reading and arguing about literature will take some practice to get used to, but it is a popular strategy for asking questions and forming strong arguments about how literature makes meaning. If you have any questions about this strategy, please let me know in class or by emailing me. Thank you.